Hey, this is Derek. I wanted to make a video about show, don't tell. This is a really common piece of writing advice you've probably heard in a million places. And the idea is when you write fiction especially, but also storytelling in nonfiction, you don't want to tell readers what's happening or give them information. You want to show them the actual scene. And part of this is tricky because you're using words, but you're building a picture with your words. So it has to be something that you could capture on camera, something that looks like something. So I'm actually going to give you 3 secret tips that'll help you to show, don't tell. Because I know this can be really confusing. When I get people sending me their manuscripts to edit, I will often comment, this is telling, this is showing. You can do both within reason. Sometimes there's a need to tell. If it's like a sentence or two, sometimes it makes sense not to show everything. Often because, going off on a tangent, whatever you show, picture you have a big camera and you're zooming in on specific things. Whatever you choose to show on the screen has to matter. It has to have importance. And the more that it matters, the more you zoom in on it. So if you're planting like a red herring, you want to show it, but you want to move past it without calling too much attention or reaction to it, or else you'll kind of give away the secrets. But if you want something to be dramatic or painful or emotional, you have to really zoom in and capture that scene. And one common sign of weak writing that I come across often is when people show and tell. Telling is basically explaining to readers what's happening. So you're about to go into a scene, you're about to show the action, the dialogue, the setting, anything that's in the scene in present action. But before you let readers see that, you explain it to them. You kind of explain who the players are, why they feel this way, what happened between them 6 years ago, why they have this or that object with them, because maybe it feels like you need to explain it before you get to the scene. And in some cases that can be true. When you do that, by the way, So when you do that, by the way, that's probably because you have a scene and you figured out that maybe it's unclear or not obvious, or you've gotten feedback. So before you get to it, you plant the information to make sure readers have all the information they need to understand the scene. And that solves the problem. It's just a little clunky and unprofessional. What you really need to do is go back several pages or chapters and plant that information earlier, because when it's right before the scene that's relevant, it's going to come across as heavy-handed. And heavy-handed just means like you're being too obvious with your craft, and readers can see what you're doing, and that's kind of what you want to avoid. So the other thing I would try to warn against is when you're saying the same thing twice. Repetition is a personal pet peeve of mine, so that's something I comment on a lot, but repetition just means you already told readers the details, and now the scene is just playing out what you already said to readers. Every scene has to have something new or surprising or unexpected, something that develops, something that changes in every scene. But when one thing changes and you take all the power out of the scene, especially if you preempt it by explaining or giving away the game first, and then you let the scene play out, they've already seen it, they already know what happens. Nothing in that scene is going to be dramatic or engaging. But I know that when you're self-editing, actually identifying the sentences where you're showing versus telling can be really tricky. So I have 3 tips that you've probably never heard before, because I just discovered them, about how to figure out whether you're showing or telling. The first one is to think about who is saying this. So with the words on the page, you want to identify the passages where the narrator is speaking directly to the readers. So the narrator is the one talking. Sometimes I see this with, like, in the description, there's some random adjectives thrown in, like, and then she grabbed her cool, pretty coat or whatever. And when you throw in adjectives like that, there's the implied assumption that your characters are thinking those adjectives about those things, which may be out of place or out of character, especially if it's like an action scene. They won't be noticing their pretty coat right there. So then it becomes obvious that it's the narrator, not the character, who's doing the talking and communicating directly to the readers. That's basically called breaking the third wall, I believe, when you talk directly to readers. It's something that they do in some Netflix shows where, you know, the characters are dialoguing with themselves, and then the character turns directly at the camera and looks into the camera and talks to readers directly. So even if you're not technically breaking the third wall, it's still kind of like doing that, even if you're not doing it intentionally. If you are giving information directly to readers that your characters are not involved with, you're having kind of a private discussion, that's a red flag where you are telling and not showing. You need to erase yourself from the scene and let the scene do all of the work, and all the new information or changes or reveals needs to happen within the context of the action inside the scene without you stepping in, because it's really distracting. It's kind of like you go to a movie with somebody who talks the whole time and they're pressing pause and they're like, did you see this? Did you see what I did here? That's obviously not a great reading experience. It can work in very limited cases by very talented authors. It's been done before, but I would caution against it. So the second secret tip to identify whether you are showing or telling, which is almost similar, is to figure out what your characters are doing right now. So what this means is anytime you have information, which is usually what telling is all about, you're telling information, you're giving readers context or information. Sometimes it's like a backstory dump, or it's an aside, or it's like a PS. It's like, before you appreciate the scene, you need this information. So you have to find a way of removing that direct telling and putting it into the actual scene through dialogue or something the character is doing. So the second point is what's the character is doing means what I often see is that the narrators are having a discussion with readers directly and the characters are just standing there. They're on timeout. They're frozen, they're paused. You know, wherever you were in the action, they're just waiting for the narrator to finish writing those several paragraphs of backstory or information directly to the readers. It's unconnected. The information's unconnected with the actual characters and what they're doing. And sometimes you can break it up a little bit just by including the characters with a little bit of action, a little bit of posturing, which means, you know, she crossed the room and poured herself a glass of whiskey and took a sip. If you throw in a little bit of character movement to bring that information back in the scene. But otherwise you have to find a way to get that information to the characters and show the characters' response to the information. I had another really nice video recently in my course about writing fiction where I was talking about when to give the backstory or the reveals, and the secret is whenever there's new information, it only matters when you see the character's reaction. So you don't really want the readers to learn the information before the characters learn the information. Otherwise, you've given away all of your suspense and intrigue. You don't want readers to know too much. And if readers know it first and they're waiting for the character, there can be intrigue or suspense sometimes. You know, they're waiting for the shoe to drop and for the characters to realize the same thing that readers already know. But also, you're really taking out a lot of this dramatic suspense. And eventually when the characters are like, oh my God, they finally learned this thing that the readers have known for 200 pages, it just feels really flat. You want readers and characters to discover the same thing at the same time when it matters, without the narrator stepping in and telling readers directly and then having the character respond to it separately. You want the character's response to information to be the main thing. That's the story, because dramatic story is the emotional conflict that happens to your characters. So the third piece of advice is, what does this look like? It's pretty similar to a lot of the stuff I've already said earlier, but you want to be able to picture what's happening in this scene. What does it look like? If you had a movie camera, if this was on TV, how would you portray this? So if it's just the character thinking through stuff, that can be really difficult or frustrating. You have to give them at least enough props. And one trick I like to do is give them an action verb while they're thinking things, rather than having them sit on the couch or falling asleep in bed and lying there doing nothing while they're processing all this information. give them a task like washing the dishes or taking the dog for a walk, just so there's a change of pace or scenery, and so that readers can at least picture what's happening while the characters are thinking through all of this stuff. So that's a little thing, but also, what does this look like means, like I said earlier, are the characters just standing there frozen, looking at each other while readers are consuming this information and authors are telling this information directly? Even if it's just a few sentences, it's like a pause. It's like if you were watching TV and the screen paused and the characters just stood there and then a narration came over the audio telling you something about those characters that's not present in that actual scene. It's a little bit of backstory or additional information that's not in that scene. So it doesn't belong on the camera or in the room. There's no interaction with the characters at all. It's completely cut off and separate. And that's not something I recommend for commercial fiction. Again, it's been done in rare cases, but it's always a bit unusual and weird, and often it's a sign of weak or amateur writing. I'll add one final thing about description. In my course on writing that we're doing this summer, I'm actually talking about description next week, because description is one of the last things I get to during my revision and editing phases. But one of the important little tidbits is that you need to give description when it matters to your characters. So the first time your characters are introduced to a new character or a new place, that's when they're going to notice things. And that's when you can describe the things, because they'll be looking around. And you can do a little bit of interaction. They walk over to the bookshelf, they look through the books, they open a page, whatever. Unless they're stressed out or they're concerned or there's an action scene, if there's danger, the more they're focused on one critical, suspenseful thing, the less they're going to notice their details or the surroundings. So if they're, running away from the bad guys, they're not going to stop and comment on all the scenery. You can throw in a couple really short descriptors. You can mention, the broken power line or the storm or whatever is going on in the scene, but you can't really slow down and notice everything when the characters are running through. So when you give description, it has to be related to how characters are experiencing that scene. So in one final point that doesn't exactly fit in here, but it's on my mind that I'll mention, is it's sort of similar, referring to shared experience in your writing, which is sort of like doing an analogy or a simile or a metaphor. You're basically comparing something to something else, but you're assuming that the readers also know the thing you're referring to. So for example, if I say she looked like Madonna meets Jessica Rabbit, so I will put a picture in your mind of what she looks like, but it's not actually a description. I'm not actually telling you what she really looks like. I'm giving you a symbolic stand-in for shared knowledge, so that rather than telling you what my unique character looks like, I'm comparing her to other figures that you already know. It can be done. I think it's a little bit lazy writing. There's always the fear that your readers don't know how to picture that. Maybe they're not familiar with the same characters that you're familiar with. Depends on your audience and your genre, because of course some cultural references could enhance your story or your writing, especially if, your characters are really tuned into certain things and it's relevant. But I see that done also in description sometimes. The scene looked like a scene out of Mad Max or something, where I'm not actually talking about what the scene looks like. I'm telling you to remember what Mad Max looked like and think about that instead. It is an easy way to describe things sometimes. I think I did it recently in one of my books. It has its place, but I would be careful about when you do that and when you rely on it too much, because I think it's almost better to actually describe the scene as it is in your book. Or you could do a little bit of both. So those are my 3 tips. If you're worried about show, don't tell, or what that means for your writing, think about who is saying this, what are the characters doing right now, and what does this look like? If you think about those 3 things, I think it'll be easier for you to identify when you're telling versus when you're showing. If you are showing, then all the information should be coming through the characters, either what they're doing or what they're thinking or what they're talking about, or what they're remembering. If you're going to do a flashback to something, something needs to trigger the memory so that your characters are remembering that thing in context because they were prompted by external events, not just randomly they think back to 6 years ago when they got divorced, just because this is when the author wants to share the information with readers. It has to make sense for how the characters are feeling and what's going on in their world. People don't randomly remember stuff that happened to them 6 years ago unless it's triggered by something, or if they're just in a really bad mood and they're reflecting about their past because they're feeling nostalgic. Something like that needs to happen, which is also why backstory really has no place in the first 25% of your novel. You want to focus on the action and the scene, and then once people are sympathetic to your characters and they're engaged in the suspense and the conflict and the action, then you can reveal deeper backstory to deepen the appreciation and respect for your characters, to get readers to like your characters more before you make more bad things happen, before the traumatic stuff happens, which is going to force a character shift. That's what your story is all about, the conflict that forces character shift. So it's tricky to balance all of this stuff, but I think show, don't tell, the danger of it is that when you're telling, you're taking people out of the narrative. People are engaged with your story. They're right there. They're watching it in the screen inside their heads in moving color picture. And then you interrupt and you say, excuse me, I have something to tell you. And you leave the characters hanging while you're explaining stuff. It can really take people out of the enjoyment of your story, which is why it can be dangerous, especially if you do it too often. And that's why it's often kind of shown as a writing weakness rather than, a gift, because masterful writers will keep you in the scene without breaking the tension and stepping away from it and, using the space to talk to readers directly. So I hope this video helps clear up what show, don't tell actually is, and also 3 ways you can identify it and solve it in your own writing. Let me know in the comments if this was helpful. Bye-bye.